Oh, and then the other thing that was mentioned is that many people don't actually, you know, a lot of rituals don't work, especially nowadays. So, you know, Chinese New Year ritual, I read a lot of your questions and I got the feeling that many of you don't really like it so much. You know? And there's actually family tensions, okay? Or the tensions could actually become worse during the Chinese New Year dinner, right? And then some people said, well, it's actually not necessary because people will still get together even without the ritual. Well, on that, I'm not so sure about that because, in fact, so in the past, the ritual was obligatory. Everybody had to go. There was no choice not to go. And the number of family members who attended was far larger. So the extended family was much bigger before. And the reason it was much bigger, I mean, partly was because the whole extended family did come together for its major rituals. Now the people who come together for the ritual are actually a smaller number of people. So this is the problem. And then the other problem is actually people don't even necessarily like it. So now people have a choice. And so in modern times, ritual is, it doesn't work like in the past. In the past, everybody lived together and they had no choice. And so now for a ritual to work, there's a kind of higher up the success of the kind of attractiveness of the ritual performance needs to be stronger. And so that's part of the reason why we have our society is rituals are weaker. And that's another reason why the society, somehow we get the sense that the society is, somehow the social bond is weaker than before. People are much more individualistic and somehow as we would say in Mandarin, the 凝聚力 is not as strong as before. And so this is actually a real problem. And we can see the problem globally now, right? That when everybody, you know, the international relationships are fine and people are circulating and everything like that, everybody, it seems to be okay. But when there are geopolitical tensions and suddenly, you know, oh, you know, how can we hold the world together? We don't really have any strong rituals to hold all of humanity together. So this is actually a problem. It's a challenge that we're facing. So this actually leads me to the final point on political rituals. So I'm going to ask you guys. So the Hong Kong social movement, is this a rite of passage and why? So the 2019 Hong Kong protests, is this a rite of passage and why?
Hello.
Yes.
Yeah, I think the protest for democracy in Hong Kong is definitely a rite of passage. I mean, it's a massive social movement. First, I mean, at the first stage of the rite of passage, the people break away from their normal life. They're usually students or employees who have their jobs. They just they just wear in black. I mean, it gives them a sense of collective identity. They break away from their normal identity as their individual life. They join this collective movement, and I think at the second stage of rite of passage definitely enters collective landscape. I mean, it is a collective movement. They will shout out slogans. They will sing together. Yeah, I think by doing so, they are entering a state of liminal, definitely. And I think and I think at the third stage, I think in this case, the third stage of the rite of passage. I think in terms of that, the Hong Kong people actually enter a new status, again another identity after this movement. I think by this movement, the Hong Kong people get a new identity as Hong Kongers. I mean, they are there's a feeling of unity among the people. They're all Hong Kongers, and I think by doing that, they're getting to another position, getting a new identity afterwards.
Right. So actually, this was a fascinating case of a collective Durkheimian collective effervescence structured according to Van Gennep's rite of passage, exactly as you described. And so during this liminal phase, out on the streets, it was completely different from normal life, right? And so Hong Kong life is normally so orderly, and Hong Kong people are actually normally so law-abiding, so following rules, very, very, law-abiding and obedient. But then suddenly they enter this other space and it's completely the opposite. And you're saying dressed in black, completely changing the appearance and acting completely different from normally. There was a statement that some people said that say, I don't protest because I believe because I protest. And so this is actually a religious statement right there. So there's something in that liminal stage that cannot be explained by anybody on the outside. You have to be in it, and then you understand and you will believe. So this is a deep liminal phase. And then there's all the traumatic experiences and all, the whether it's the singing, right? So all that collective effervescence of the singing, or whether it's the fighting, and all of this. So all of these really create a deep liminal kind of state. And then what was interesting is that after, the weekend, on Monday, then life completely back to normal. And I remember every weekend, even so many MTR stations, shopping malls were, vandalized and everything like that. But then on Monday, it's like all repaired, or very, very much repaired, very quickly, and everybody going back to normal. Life pretty much back to normal. So we had this like ritualized every weekend, we enter the liminal phase, and then during the weekday, we go to, that's kind of normal life. And then what you're saying, though, there's this more stronger long-term effect of a collective identity that is created. So, of course, there are many ways also that could be understood, analyzed, and interpreted, but this is definitely a kind of a quasi-religious collective, massive collective ritual or political ritual. And so this is going to lead me to the final point. And so it's going to take me more than 2 minutes to talk about it. So, but I think it's really interesting, which is about political mythology. Okay. So actually, one of you did mention that actually, politics seems to follow mythology. We seem to have political myths. And this is absolutely true. And so our political life is actually acting out myths. And this is especially the case in democratic societies, but not only, or rather there are different types of myths that we have in different types of societies. But in a sense, every society is governed by some political myths. So maybe they are not religious anymore, but they're political. And I'm going to tell you. And actually, after I tell you this, you will understand exactly what's going on in Hong Kong. So there are two myths that govern Western society. And we could say that there are two myths that govern Chinese society. And these myths are, they actually clash and reinforce each other. And Hong Kong is right in the middle of these two myths. So this is why it is very difficult for Hong Kong. But to understand this, then you can understand a lot of things. So what are some of these myths? So first of all, in China, we could say that we could go to a lot of Chinese myths, which are about order versus chaos. Okay, so the idea is that the society is, imagine it's a agricultural society, a village with the, and the fields, and people are working in the fields, working in the farm. And surrounding the village is the forest and the outside world. And so in the village and around the village, everything is harmonious. Everything is peaceful. Everything is in order. Outside, you have, first of all, you know, there used to be tigers coming out from the forest, and then also ghosts coming out from the forest, and also bandits and robbers and things like that. So outside, we have the forces of chaos who threaten our peace, you know, our life. The forces of chaos from outside who threaten our life. So we want to keep the order, we want to keep the harmony in our society, and we want to keep out all the forces that will endanger our harmony. So this is for the village, and this is the same thing for the whole country, right? So China is this agricultural country, but outside of it, you know, you have the tribes from Mongolia coming in and attacking and stealing and going away, right? And the tribes from the West coming and going and stealing and killing people and going back. So there's a harmony inside, and then outside is these forces of chaos, right? And so you could even think of the story of Huangdi and Chiyou. Okay, so one of the earliest myths of China. So you have the Yellow Emperor against Chiyou, and there's the fight between the two. And finally, Huangdi, the Yellow Emperor, establishes order, and he establishes the Chinese Empire. And now there is peace, now there is order, now there is civilization. And the forces from outside, they are the forces that endanger the peace and endanger the civilization. So this is a basic Chinese kind of myth. So many, many Chinese stories kind of have this idea. Now, what is what kind of myth is the kind of the opposite Western myth? We could say it's David and Goliath, okay? David and Goliath, okay? So we have the little guy, and the little guy is fighting against the big, tough giant. And the little guy who represents goodness, and the big, tough giant represents the bad guy, the evil. But the little guy is going to beat the bad guy. He's going to become victorious. So this is a story, a biblical story. But then we see it, and then we have this myth comes in the revolutions, okay? So the American Revolution. So the revolutionaries are the heroes. So they fight against the king. They fight against their government, you know, and they are the heroes. They go into the street and they fight, and then they are victorious, they win. And then the French Revolution. And then we have other revolutions and so on and so forth. So the little guy fighting against the despot, fighting against the dictator, right? This is the deep Western myth, okay? It's the deep Western myth. So, okay, but what happens when you have that myth and the Chinese myth come together? Well, you have the fighters for democracy, but they then become in the Chinese myth, they are the forces of disorder who are threatening the entire stability of society, right? So then in that myth, you have to stop it. But then how do you see it from the Western side? Well, that strong, harmonious society is like Goliath, stopping the little guy, right? So these two myths, they actually kind of, they reinforce each other in a simple way, in a certain way, right? So those two. Now we have two others. What is another really important Western myth is the myth of conquest, okay? I mean, basically, you know, it's like, and it goes back to Greece, you know, Odysseus and Jason and the Argonauts. And then so we have even some Greek stories about this. Prometheus, he went out to explore. He went out far away to explore. Then we have like Christopher Columbus, he goes out. So then we have these explorers, they go out and they conquer. They go out, they conquer, they subjugate, they dominate. And they are the heroes because they do that. They go out to these new lands and they subjugate and dominate these new lands. And then they build civilization in these new lands, okay? So then they end up, so these heroes, you know, they subjugate all the wild people there, all the uncivilized people, you know, and so that's the heroes, and they ended up, and so these heroes then dominate the whole world. So So this is another kind of a deep Western kind of myth that, so the West are the conquering civilization that knows what is true and knows what is good. Okay, so that's the Western myth. But then what do we have on the Chinese side? Well, we have another myth, and this is the Chinese revolutionary myth, right? It's like, well, we are going to resist that kind of domination, right? So we're not going to let ourselves to be dominated in that way. We're not going to let ourselves to be humiliated in that way. So we're going to fight back. So we're going to fight back, right? And so the heroes on the Chinese side are those who fight back against that Western domination. So yeah, so the Chinese society, you know, in a sense has, we could say, one traditional myth, which is this myth of preserving order against chaos. And it has its revolutionary myth, its modern revolutionary myth, which is liberating China against the oppressors from the West. And in the West, we also have our myths, which is the myths of, right, the people against the ruler, and the myth of the conqueror, right? The myth of the conqueror, the world conqueror, yeah. So we look at all these movies, so many movies, and you can see Hollywood movies, somehow they often have these, you will find some aspect of this. I mean, Star Wars is a very good example, okay? A very, very good example. It's the little people against the, you know, the empire, right? And but then also yeah. So anyway, so these myths, they're very, very strong. And so although they're not really directly religious, but somehow they're quasi-religious. They really structure the way our societies operate. And in a place like Hong Kong is a place that is deeply structured by both Western and Chinese culture and society and politics. So these myths, they clash directly in Hong Kong. And so this is why it's very traumatic, we could say, for Hong Kong, for everybody in Hong Kong. So yeah, so that's a food for thought. So these ideas of mythology, of ritual, rite of passage are very deep, very profound. And so then the question is, well, what can you do about it? I mean, or how, you know, or how can you, is there any way to overcome, you know, the divisions caused by this? And so that's a very deep question. And I will talk about some aspects of this in the coming weeks. Yeah. So the question is, how can we have myth and how can we have ritual that does not divide humanity into two groups of people, you know, the good guys and the bad guys, right? How can we have myths and rituals that that can transcend these kinds of divisions, or it's rather a choice, right? Do we want to have this mythic? Do we want to be living a mythic battle? You know, is that what we want to be doing in life, or do we want to transcend those kind of mythical battles? But then, how do you do it, right? This is actually one of the main questions that our society is facing today. All over the world. Yeah, so that's it. And if you want to hang out for some more questions, just please feel free to do so. And otherwise, see you next week.